Hi, this is Dr. Harriet Fraad with another episode of Capitalism Hits Home, a show dedicated to exploring the effects of capitalism on gender, family, and relationships. Today, I want to talk about the women's movement, what it was, what it is now, and how it could be a movement for everyone. The women's movement is re-emerging. We're confronted every day by a president who's the pussy grabber in chief, who has 19 allegations of sexual abuse against him. We have to see this all the time. We have to see, should we call it his cocky attitude? At the same time, we confront an America that's been transformed from the most egalitarian nation in the Western developed world in 1970 to one of the least egalitarian nations in the Western world today. All people are affected, especially the young. The doors of opportunity are closing on their hands, and they're drowning in debt. The current women's movement is far different from the women's movement that emerged in the 1960s and 1970s. I know because I'm a founding mother of that movement. And that has a lot to do with the political economy of America, which has been transformed. The earlier women's movement usually didn't engage the broad issues of the U.S. economy. It focused more on the problems of women devalued against men's greater valuation. Our women and our movement wanted access to a greater range of jobs, of prestige. We wanted equal wages. We needed to break out of the restricted world of domesticity into the intellectual, political, and economic worlds. Ours was a movement of predominantly young women wanting in to the worlds of the intellect, wanting into the economy, wanting into politics. As the slogan then said, a woman's place is in the House and the Senate. Women had been previously liberated for a short period during World War II, where they were pushed into the workforce to take jobs vacated by men who were fighting overseas. Rosie the Riveter was a government-approved model for us. She showed her bicep and said, "Yes, we can." They needed us to work in the munitions factories and other factories that had been abandoned. After World War II, women were pushed back into the home to make room for the returning GIs. In the late 40s and 50s, sex discrimination replaced work encouragement. The happy suburban housewife replaced Rosie the Riveter. Widespread, federally funded quality child care centers were closed. Propaganda abounded with its usual subservient intellectual studies behind it, showing that children were harmed if their mothers worked outside of the home. They used studies of orphans who were utterly neglected and never held to prove that point. The Spitz studies. That, of course, demeaned the 25% of women who still had to work to make ends meet or who were single moms, although there were very few single moms at that time. I think there were, 1960, there were 10% or 5% of single moms. Now there's 40%, quite a difference. They were considered in the popular press as bad, unfeminine, neglectful mothers. The current women's movement rose strongly after the recent recession of 2008, the Occupy movement of 2011, and with a boost from the Bernie Sanders campaign and the campaigns for women in office, as well as a boost from the outrageous sexism of Donald Trump. Unlike the 60s and 70s, now women see men as quite often in the same boat as ourselves. The need for basic economic change for both men's lives and women's lives together is different from the gender men versus women, women versus men environment of the 60s and 70s. Gloria Steinem had the terrible slogan, "A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle." Actually, we all need each other, and we always did. The American boat is sinking for the mass of American people. Men and women are now drowning together. Today, dividing men is less important from women is much less important than rallying for change. Just as the integrated demonstrations of the Black Lives Matter movement, where people are together fighting for racial transformation, the women's movement and the recent March for Women's Lives were enthusiastically integrated by men and women of all colors. What is the difference between the reality now from the realities of the 60s and 70s America? Well, in the 1960s and 70s, the rest of the developed world was just recovering from being utterly decimated by World War II. We were the only intact economy to survive. So that at that time, we had our full capacity. And also at that time, we were a predominantly white nation. That has changed. At that point, there was a lot to fear on the part, at the end of World War II, on the part of the rich and the government. During the war, our ally was Uncle Joe. That was Joseph Stalin. 1 in every 4 families had an active communist as a member of the family. FDR hired many communists. Those people who were so highly taxed after during World War II and before in the Depression, FDR levied a tax of 96.4% on the highest incomes. Now it's hard to count since so many people have tax shelters overseas that people like Trump can bellow about he doesn't pay any taxes. So that after World War II, the big capitalist establishment was really frightened. And they persuaded, through Joseph McCarthy, a virulent anti-communist, they persuaded Americans that being a communist was treason. McCarthy, it should be said, also was the head of the Housing Committee in Congress. And it was he who pushed that housing aid should go to suburban, segregated developments like Levittown, where you could not get a house as a returning veteran unless your wife was home and you had children, 2, no more, and that you bought all your appliances from GE, and there were several, and you could never entertain interracial friends. So that they instituted, under the name of anti-communism, a kind of suburban, racist, chauvinist American pattern. With a lot of pressure, they did set up some African-American developments that were strictly segregated as well, and inferior. It's covered in a book called Picture Windows, A History of the Suburbs. There were 2 streams of energy and focus in the early women's movement of the 60s and 70s. One was a stream of the government's fear of females organizing, and the other was the energy of left women who had been active against the war in Vietnam and now wanted a movement for women. And they started what was then called the Women's Liberation Movement. The earliest women's liberation movement, 65, 66 to the 70s, included the notes from the first and second year, which came out in 69 and 70, had articles such as Class Structure Within the Women's Movement, which was a Marxian class analysis, quoting Engels, and the problems with the liberal takeover of the women's movement, which decried the dominant CIA influences of Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine. Carol Hainish, in her article, protested Gloria Steinem's influence in reducing the class militancy of the movement and molding it into a liberally accepted gender-only movement. At that time, there was something called the Great Wurlitzer, which was a plan by the FBI, it's written up in a book of that name, and the CIA to influence the race movement and the movement for civil rights, not just race, and the women's movement into a race-only and gender-only movement, and exacting from it the class component. As radicals, we felt that because we were at the bottom of the wage and opportunity level, if we stood up, we would erase all class and race barriers. That was quite naive, very naive. In fact, we were so naive that when Gloria Steinem said, I have a magazine, we'll call it Ms., we were so pleased we didn't look at who's financing that, Gloria, that we don't need any ads. And it's got a lot of money. We were really naive. And so by the mid to late 70s, the women's movement was robbed of its class component. It became a gender-only movement that didn't question capitalism. For example, one institution that grew out of it, now the National Organization for Women, pushes for legislation that benefits women, which is very useful, but it's totally divorced from class content. Other institutions like the Rape Crisis Center and the Battered Women's Shelter provide very useful services and usually get financed by state and city money and therefore can't be critical politically or economically, can't criticize the capitalist system. In a third dramatic example, the women's movement at the beginning combined demands for abortion on demand with an end to forced sterilizations, because at that time, sterilization, and for a long time, forced sterilizations were practiced on the prison population and on people of color. By excluding the forced sterilization demand, we excluded a lot of women of color from the movement. In summary, the domination of the women's movement by the CIA's Gloria Steinem and the liberal establishment split the movement from minority women and white working class women. These are the 99% who need to work for a living wage and desperately need free child care, medical care, paid family leaves, and elder care in recognition of the importance of our caring and often menial labor and our emotional labor. The women's movement became a movement for gender equality within a system of ever greater inequality economically. The women's movement from its beginnings made a serious mistake in ignoring the strength and knowledge that you can create through creating a clean and orderly, attractive environment. It also neglected what you learn from caring for vulnerable lives and children. Women joined men in disparaging women's work. It was called shit work. rather than learning from it, valorizing it, and teaching it to each other, and teaching men its importance. Obviously, men were less motivated to do this work, which was so badly disparaged both by women and men. Had we recognized the value of that labor to the society, and really none of us would be alive if it weren't for the emotional and physical care that we got as infants, if we taught it that value to ourselves and to the society and to men, we would have expanded our reach to traditional women. As it is, the only recognition still for women's traditional work is the sentimental recognition in country music for the population that often votes against every enhancement to women's lives, but who valorizes my mom who cared for me and loved me, thanks to you, and so on. Meanwhile, I won't pay you anything, and you'll go into an old age home because I can't afford to take care of you, and the conditions will be terrible. The movement made another error that alienated us from working class women. It didn't stress the importance of free quality childcare. That's one of the reasons most often cited by women for why their work is hard, or for free quality elder care that would allow mothers and adult daughters to be free of the obligation of caring personally. One thing that the movement did in the 60s and 70s is raise the issue of sexual objectification for women. Women boycotted beauty contests and marriage, bridal fairs. I remember an organization of which I was a fun part, the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. It was called, invaded bridal fairs and made fun of them and, released mice in the bridal fair. And Elizabeth Arden is a lizard in your garden. We had all of these sayings to put down the makeup and the get-up of brides who were culturally assumed to be at the pinnacle of their lives, to be married, that was their career. And at that time, women could stay home and be supported. That ended. Unfortunately, then and now, sex work of all kinds is one of the only ways that young women can make a living unless they have an education. And they can't intern for free unless they have money. So unless it's sex work is the one career opportunity for women that is highly paid. In fact, paid higher than sex work for men. The sugar industry is a good example. I'll cover that in another podcast, in which young women find a sugar daddy who pays their tuition, and 45% of sugar babies have educational debt that is helped or eliminated by a sugar daddy. In fact, one of the most popular sites is called Sugar Baby University, where there's a very sexy woman wearing glasses. What feminist demands were met, we can ask ourselves, by the 60s and 70s movement? Well, it did accomplish a great deal. Most professions are actually open to women. And in those professions where women are emotionally and sexually harassed, like their full participation in elite business schools like Harvard and Yale, and fields such as science, technology, math, and engineering, we do have an established legal right to challenge that order. That was recently done at Harvard. They challenged the sexual harassment and demeaning of women in the business school. Women are now the majority of people in higher education. We're the majority of lower-level managers because our skills in trying to make peace in a household, in negotiating and compromising rather than pushing, are rewarded. We went from earning 59% of the male dollar to earning 80% of the male dollar now. Except for mothers, of course, who earn 70% of the male dollar. Title IX, which required that equal money be given to men's and women's sports, isn't usually obeyed in the United States, but one can sue and claim and push. Marriage is no longer honored as the great career fulfillment of a woman's life. In fact, a man who can support dependent women and children is rare. It was the women's movement that did start institutions like rape crisis centers and battered women's shelters that now have some funding. What the women's movement didn't accomplish also has to be asked. We neglected class issues that hold women back, such as equality in universal, free, or heavily subsidized education from childcare on, paid maternity and paternity leaves. We failed to fight strongly and win on these issues. We were mainly women without children. We failed to recognize the 99%, which includes the 99% of women, who often need financial help from partners and are trapped in miserable marriages because they can't survive without the marriage. Also, we were naive in ways that benefited capitalism. We allowed women like Gloria Steinem, who was very skillful, to push our movement into the gender-only limited sphere where working-class women were eliminated. We helped women enter the capitalist marketplace. And that was I can see why the CIA subsidized that. At that point, capitalists were outsourcing and mechanizing men's jobs. They needed an ideological force to get out there and say, yes, this is for women, without all the other things like the changes in the class structure that we neglected. We neglected a powerful demand for free quality child care, after school and summer care, elder care, health care, maternity and paternity leaves, with guaranteed positions for women when they return to their employment. In the other countries that do give generous maternity and paternity leave, the government subsidizes the company during those leaves and allows them to go back to a well-paid job when they return. If the company has to compensate, companies will fight that. All of those crucial empowerments for women and freeing men from the economic burden of women's lives weren't aggressively demanded or won. And those demands would address the poverty conditions of U.S. single women and children. In the half-century since the 60s and 70s, the U.S. economy has totally been transformed. In the 60s, if you had a family with a white male bread earner, every generation could do better than the one that preceded it, and most families were white. And white men earned family wages. That ended, as I said, because the capitalists ended it. With the huge money those capitalists earned by exploiting people in poor countries without ecological standards and guarantees and benefits, American companies made huge fortunes, which they brought back to America and bought our media and our politicians. We ended up with the best democracy money can buy, and a wealth distribution which is one of the biggest in the Western developed world. That's over now. For the first time in U.S. history, the majority of American women are single, and glad to be. 40% of U.S. babies are born outside of marriages, even though they are the poorest people in our society. In the city where I live, New York, 1 out of 3 children goes hungry. That's amazing. In the nation in the nation as a whole, 1 out of 6 children goes without adequate food. More than half of marriages end in legal separation or divorce, and those are the people who get married. The majority of people between 18 and 35 that used to be considered prime fertility ages don't get married. Class still in the United States is the most repressed discourse in America. We had a race-only movement with Black Power. We had a gender-only women's movement. And it was only in the 3 months that Occupy was allowed to live until the Obama administration had a nationwide smashing of that movement. But in those 3 months, it reintroduced a class discourse of the 1% and 99% in a country like America. Now men and women are both sinking in the same boat together. We need each other to win better lives for all of us. Only a movement acknowledging differences between men and women and blacks and whites and browns or whatever, gays and straights, but with a shared class agenda that addresses all these issues together has a chance to win the changes we need. As it turns out, by acknowledging and addressing class issues, the huge discrepancy between minority and white wealth and jobs, and between men and women, can be transformed. And we can all fight together and demand together for the equality we need and the greater freedom that we can pursue, in which we can pursue our dreams. Mass cultural campaigns can make the entire group aware and militant against what were only women's concerns when the women's movement began. Men in mass media need to be shown cooking, taking care of their babies, cleaning, and boys need to be widely seen caring for their doll babies. And they need to be encouraged to do nurturing in their classes. Girls need to be seen with their dolls and their toy trucks and erector sets. With class transformation and fair taxation, we can change the problems that are faced by the 99%, who were the millions demonstrating in the marches for women's lives all over America. Some of the things we can achieve are quality public education and childcare, after school, summer care, rewards for emotional labor and caring labor, respect and wage parity for menial labor, paternity and maternity leaves, universal quality health care, and safe retirement provisions for all. All we have is each other. The 1% has the money and controls the physical forces of repression, the police and the military. We do the labor on which our country demands. We still have internet freedom and non-corporate media, and most of all, we have each other. We all together have each other. Thank you for listening. This episode has been brought to you by Democracy at Work. Please support our work. Visit our website at democracyatwork.info.